Where is God in the midst of suffering? How can there be one truth amongst so many different beliefs, people, and religions? How are science and faith compatible with one another? These are things that not just skeptics wrestle with, but we all struggle to try to figure out what it is that we believe. I've got questions. You've got questions. We're going to go on this journey not alone, but with some of the great thinkers of our time, and we're going to try to learn from them and from one another the great mystery that is our faith.
So we are getting to talk about the big questions of faith. And the question that we're going to tackle today is a question that I remember vividly from being in high school. We were sitting on the front lawn of Sarah Sutter's house when we were in youth group. It was a beautiful day outside in Central Texas. The Baylor student who was leading our small group was having us to sit down to open our Bibles when all of a sudden this one conversation came up. It was the subject of predestination and free will. We were all friends. We all knew one another. We were all part of the same church. And it was like exploding dynamite in the midst of that group. People had different convictions. There were tears. People were so upset. It was the first real church fight that I had ever seen. What a fascinating and yet explosive conversation where everybody has an opinion. Everybody thinks that they understand how it works. What we're going to talk about is, what does the Bible say? What is the subject of where the overlay of God's sovereignty and our choice, and how do those things come together in one of the most mysterious, important, and difficult discussions in the question of faith?
One of the areas where people really wrestle is in understanding, it's a classic debate in Christianity, predestination and free will, the sovereignty of God versus the freedom of humanity. And a lot of people get paralyzed by that discussion. So when those questions come up for you, how do you help somebody navigate that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in general, because of the cultural context that we live in, we instinctively skew towards human freedom and wanting to defend human freedom at all costs. We have a really hard time even actually with thinking about corporate responsibility or people being dealt with in any way that's not just individual, because of this is our 21st century Western way of thinking. And I think that presents us with multiple challenges when we come to the scriptures and often see people being dealt with at the level of family or at the level of nation, or in ways that aren't just individual. And so my guess is that probably for most of us, our instinct is to want to defend human freedom, and will actually hold the sovereignty of God with a more open hand. It sort of feel more comfortable for us to say, well, God wasn't really in control, so long as we're preserving human freedom.
I think we naturally fall into dichotomous ways of thinking, either this or that, but not both. But what Scripture does is set before us this very rich and complex picture of human responsibility and accountability alongside the sovereignty and the graciousness of God. And very often we think that these cannot be consistent with each other. But maybe the fact that they are difficult to understand, difficult for us to bring together, should not lead us to think they are inconsistent. They are different sides of a very complex discussion. And for me, knowing that I am accountable, I'm responsible, but that there is this powerful, gracious God who is also in the picture, means that I act knowing I don't act on my own, but rather in the presence and power of a gracious God. It means I don't act on my own, but rather I act in and through God. And that to me is very important. It's not about saying I'm a free agent on my own. It's not about saying God's a free agent on his own. It's about, look, I am myself and I'm trying to act as God wants me to It's I who have to do this, but I know God is helping me to do this, so I'm not on my own. I hold these things together, maybe in a way that's not perfectly synthesized, but nevertheless there's this deep gut theological instinct that this way of thinking means I need to do things. But I also realize that God is far more deeply involved in this whole process than I very often realize.
It's one of the frustrating things, I have a little shopping list of if and when I get to meet St. Paul one day, there's certain passages I really want to say, what exactly was going on there? And what he says in Romans 8:29 and following, which is, it's so dense, that's part of the problem. It's like packed in. Those he predestined, he also called, he justified, he glorified. Whoa, wait a minute, can we just spell that out? But I think what Paul is doing is pulling together the narrative of Romans to that point. And the narrative of Romans to that point pivots on chapter 4, which is about the covenant with Abraham and God promising Abraham a worldwide family. And if we go back to the Pentateuch, you see from Genesis and Exodus and then particularly Deuteronomy, God saying, it's not because you are the greatest nation in the world that I want you to be my people. In fact, you're a scruffy little nation, no good at all, but it's because I love you and I have purposes for you. And so right from the beginning, it is a call for people to be God's people, but it's a call so that through them, God will do what he's going to do in the world. Part of the trick of Romans 8 is that glorification is not simply a code for going to heaven and shining like an electric light bulb. Actually, the idea, which is how a lot of Christians have thought of it,
Sure.
The glory which Paul is speaking of there comes from Psalm 8, which is the psalm which goes back to Genesis 1, that humans are made in the image of God, and the psalm says, you made us little lower than the angels in order to crown us with glory and honor. Paul has already referred to that in Romans 2, putting all things in subjection under their feet, under human control. And what we see in Romans 8 is Jesus himself as the Lord of the world and God's people called and predestined to share his rule over creation. And the way that works in Romans 8 is through suffering and through prayer. That's what it means to be caught up in the purposes of God. And the idea that you abstract from that into a kind of philosophical thing of determinism versus free will, and has God just pre-programmed us, or are we just random atoms flitting around doing our own thing? That's a gross diminution of the biblical theology which Paul is drawing on.
I think we see from very early in the scriptures, we see both human responsibility and God's sovereignty at play. I was reading Exodus with my daughters a few months ago. We sort of go through a book of the Bible together as a family in the evenings, just little chunk after little chunk, and reading through the plagues that hit Egypt and how Pharaoh, how the text sometimes says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, sometimes it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And you're like, well, wait a minute, which is it?
What gives?
What's happening here? And so even in stories like that, we see human responsibility and divine sovereignty. Or if you think of Joseph saying to his brothers after they have their reunion, the brothers who sold him into slavery, and now he's in the position to save them from famine. And he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good.
If we say we determine everything, we are free agents and there's no one to interfere with us, so what we do is good and right and we do it freely, what happens when we mess up, as we so often do? You look at history and it's all about human freedom. It's a series of messes. The whole idea of predestination is that God is able to do something, to nudge us, to redirect us, to counter our abuse of our freedom. And for me, that's very important. It's about God able to nudge us back on track when we mess up, as we so often do.
And we see it at the cross. You say, well, the Roman soldiers who were nailing Jesus to the cross, were they acting on their own free will and sinning terribly in what they did? Yeah, I think it's very clear from the scriptures that they were, though Jesus was praying even then for their forgiveness. Was it also what God had planned from eternity past would happen? Yes. So I think we need to hold those two things together It's not intuitive to us. Like I say, we quite happily often sacrifice God's sovereignty at the expense of human freedom. But I do think we need to hold those two things together and recognize that the Bible presents us with a God who is completely in control and with a God who will hold us to account.
Philosophy tends to see things in 2 dimensions at the point where theology sees them in 3 dimensions. And in the 3rd dimension, and it's no accident that it's often a Trinitarian dimension, then there is a roundedness which gives more of a flexibility to the whole thing. It doesn't mean there isn't a mystery, but it means it's a mystery to do with the way God is in the world. And part of the problem comes if we imagine that God is an actor in the world like other actors in the world, so that then it's a zero-sum game that either God is doing it or somebody else is doing it. That is a classic 18th century mistake again, that either this is supernatural or it's natural. And no, that's a diminution of the way that the Bible would see it. So the danger with predestination, of course, is that people think, oh, well, there's nothing I can do, God's determined it all, the cards are already dealt. And all I'm left doing is imagining that I'm free, but actually, God has not given me any freedom at all. Whereas, in fact, again and again in the New Testament, we are very firmly told, if the Son sets you free, you will be truly free. And this is the funny thing, we are predestined in order to be more and more free.
I think it has changed in a number of ways. I think that the most interesting way for me is a kind of emergence of a Christian pragmatism. We're never going to solve this. We can't deny one, we can't deny the other. They're both really important. What we can try and do is say we just need to figure out how to live in this middle place, recognizing God's sovereignty, recognizing our responsibility. One of my favorite Christian writers is J.I. Packer, who studied here at Oxford many years ago. And he simply says, look, we're never going to solve this intellectually, but spiritually, pragmatically, we can live the Christian life knowing we are exercising our responsibility and being accountable to this omnipotent God. And I can live and work with that.
Well, it's interesting that the truth in the New Testament is often at both extremes rather than at the middle. Jesus is 100% God, and he's 100% human. It's not like he's 50% God and 50% human, but actually he's 100% God and 100% human at the same time. So the truth about Jesus is at both extremes. And I think it's the same is true about predestination and free will. According to the New Testament, we are 100% predestined, and we have 100% free will.
I think it does remain a mystery because, in families and communities, you look at somebody who you really thought was a believer or going to be a believer, and they just go further and further and further away. You say, why, Lord? We've prayed for them, we've loved them. Why? And we're not given an answer to that. There's a lot of things we're not given an answer to. But I think only if we understand predestination in terms of that great story of Israel, climaxing in Jesus, and then given by the Spirit to God's people so that they can be his people for the world, only when we tell the story that way will we actually be getting anywhere near the truth.
It's a paradox. Light is a wave and a particle, and those two things, they can't be both, but actually it's true. So paradoxes can be true. And Jesus being 100% God and 100% human being is a paradox, but it's true. Having the sovereignty of God is really important, to know that the Lord reigns, whatever you're going through in life. God is in control of your life, that you can trust that he's sovereign. But it's also really important that you have 100% free will in what you do, that God has given us freedom, and we have the freedom to choose. And those two things are really, really important. But they're both there.
I think the real danger is that we feel that if we can't understand it, it's not right. What we need to realize is simply that there are limits to what we can understand. It's like the doctrine of the Trinity. It seems very, very difficult. Indeed, it was one of the causes of my atheism. Nowadays, I say, look, God is so great, so wonderful. how on earth can we ever take him in fully? What we need to do is to try and expand our minds to take in the greatness of God rather than reduce God to what we can understand. And that applies equally to this whole business of predestination and human autonomy.
I love what you just said there on the expansion of our minds in order to try to behold God and his wonder, because so often people think of religion today and they think of religion being myopic, but in reality what I hear you saying is that faith actually gives us the ability to expand, not to contrast our thoughts. Tell me more about that.
For me, faith expands our vision of reality. It says, don't constrict God. Don't, in effect, close things down. Try and open them up. And that's one of the reasons why worship is so important to the Christian. This is about celebrating the majesty and greatness of God and opening ourselves up, our minds, our imaginations, the depths of our souls to the greatness of God. Not just understanding, but celebrating as well.
Hopefully, as we've talked about the nature of this discussion, you have felt the pull of the mystery of how both our freedom and God's work come together in a mysterious way. I talked about at the beginning that really difficult youth group conversation where people's emotions really got heated. There was one other time I got into a really significant fight over predestination and free will. It was along the coastline of the Cinque Terre, and it was in June of 1999. I was on my honeymoon. We were at a restaurant in a castle, hanging over the edge of the cliff, looking at the amazing blue waters of the Mediterranean. With love in our eyes, Kelly and I somehow, two seminary students who had just recently graduated, got on the subject of predestination and free will. After a little bit of discussion, after a little bit of debate, and then, because we both like to be right, we really got into it. My first ever fight with my wife was over the discussion of predestination and free will. We've been fighting about this for centuries. It's not something we're fighting over. It's not a contest. It's not about who can see things exactly the way that they are. It's the mystery of God's love. And the further we enter into the mystery of that love, the deeper we will understand the nature of how God respects us, honors us, and is here to serve us. And yet, in spite of it all, he is always in charge. And so maybe we can push past our debates and push through the emotions and get to the point where we understand that God has made a choice in Jesus Christ for us. And if we reframe that discussion and we understand it, this question takes on a whole different level of meaning.